So yes, today I'm going to be talking about the aftermath of trauma a lot. I've entitled it "Discovering the Private Inner World," and this presentation is largely based on the work that I did during my doctorate in existential psychology and psychotherapy at the New School. Um, and and so yeah, I feel like I of course I'm incredibly aligned to it because I have just spent the last 3 4 years immersed in it, but I genuinely feel passionate about sharing some of these more specific discoveries. You can only cover so much of a 78,000 word thesis in an hour's presentation, but I feel really passionate about sharing these some of these ideas because I feel that as I was on this journey creating this doctorate, I was sharing it with the occasional colleague and friend, and it felt like they could really resonate with some of these, not just as a practitioner but as just a human being as well. So I want us to keep that in mind during this presentation. I'm not sure, and obviously we're not in a live room, so I can't ask for hands of who is a practitioner or not, but I know that these, friends of psychotherapy conferences tend to bring people that are interested or working as psychotherapists. So I'm going to be speaking from that kind of lens, as if I'm speaking to people who are interested in working it psychotherapeutically. So this we're looking at how this might be useful for our clients, but really too, I would say equally importantly, how this could benefit ourselves, because as a as a human, we might be working, as a practitioner, we might be working with trauma, we might be working with pain, but we might very well also be experiencing it ourselves. And I think it's important never to forget that and to respect and acknowledge and honor that. So an underlying question to keep in mind during this presentation is, what pains have you been through and why do they still hurt today? When I was creating this clearly not overly complicated slide, but this slide nevertheless, I was very thoughtful in the fact that I changed the word trauma to traumas, and then I changed the word traumas to pain, and then I changed the word pain to pains, because it's often that we speak when we're looking at training about trauma, the big T trauma, the big intense quite obvious life events which are very clearly overwhelming, very clearly painful, but we have a potential tendency to forget the everyday pains which we might be experiencing, both for ourselves and for our clients. And again, the pluralistic here, the pains, the traumas, the difficulties, the challenges that we are facing on a day-to-day. What pains have you been through and why do they still hurt today? So in this presentation, we're going to be looking at the inevitability of encountering traumatic events, either firsthand or vicariously. And again, it feels important to acknowledge that these pains, these traumas, these challenges that we face, they don't have to just come from our life experiences. I think it's very easy to invalidate it when we are truly impacted by something that we haven't experienced firsthand, to invalidate the influence that our clients and our clients' traumas might have and how we are absorbing that, even bearing in mind always that we are in a context, we are always embedded in a context. And all of us have just lived through, well, in this UK country, that we've lived through Brexit, we've lived through the pandemic as a global species. And so always there is going to be influence in our life, in our everyday world, that can be painful, not just clearly and obviously, but from all of these different angles. Even if we think, oh no, I wasn't really impacted by Brexit, it didn't really hugely impact me, but we can be surprising ourselves by how much we can be impacted by what's going on around us and by the traumas that kind of as a collective we are also experiencing. We're going to be looking at how the aftermath of trauma can pave the way to a journey of either healing or torture. There's, as I will probably reiterate this later in the presentation, but the aftermath of trauma can be slightly neglected in the way that it's investigated in the field of research. This is something that I was finding out during my own research project, is that a lot of the focus is on the traumatic event itself, but rarely is it so deeply investigated what happens after that trauma, either in the short term, directly afterwards, or in the long term. And one of the things that my research really revealed again and again and again and again was that what happens in the aftermath of the trauma is incredibly important when you're considering that the long-term and short-term impact that has on the human's life and well-being and character development and everything really. Certain feedback from how the trauma is understood or heard when that trauma is shared with other people can become incredibly nurturing. It can create a very safe journey of healing, and likewise it can be incredibly torturous. It can be incredibly painful if when we share or when one shares their trauma, it is responded to in an unhelpful way. This presentation, we're also going to be looking at why having an awareness of what does and doesn't feel right within us is really fundamental in the world of uncertainty. And this concept of uncertainty, for those who are familiar with the existential approaches to thinking, the existential philosophies, this theme of uncertainty is really a big topic. This uncertainty, not just in the fact that we don't know exactly what life is going to hold, but we don't know exactly what pain we're going to encounter. We have already mentioned the fact that it's quite inevitable that we are going to encounter pain in some shape or form at some point in our life, most likely quite frequently. But how are we also going to respond to that pain? We might have prepared ourselves and believe ourselves to be an incredibly strong person, and I've experienced that pain in that many ways before, so I know how to handle that. And we can be quite shocked by our own responses to pain, and this is all part of this uncertainty that we have to live with as a human being. We're also going to look at how we can gain awareness of our truths via our inner dialogue, and this was the big focus of my research project. The inner dialogue is something that we'll start to look at a lot later in the presentation. Something hopefully that you will connect with whether or not you've explicitly thought about it before. First, let's consider the concept and the experience of validating trauma. We ask the question, what counts as trauma? And I think ultimately why we're considering this question is because it is so important. It is so important to acknowledge that something is painful, because if we don't, we can find it very difficult to do anything about it. It can be really just a real challenge in the first place to acknowledge that we're hurting, to acknowledge that something was painful. And why is that? Why are we so well equipped at invalidating our trauma? I write a couple of little examples here, but the list could go on and on and on. They've had it worse comparing ourselves to others, or I've had it worse comparing ourselves to previous times of our own life. It could have been worse. What the future, we don't know what that's going to hold either. Here's that theme of uncertainty coming up again. I don't have time to deal with this is a particularly popular one for people that, really have found themselves immersed in this world of always being busy, always being occupied, having a lot of responsibility. Did it really happen that way? Doubting ourselves. I don't want it to be true. All of these are themes which came up not only in my research, but in other research to do with trauma. And this, like, we are so well equipped quit that, at invalidating our experiences, and for so many reasons. But it's so fundamental to kind of be mindful of our habitual way of doing that, and to give ourselves the space to acknowledge it. If we don't acknowledge it, we really struggle to heal with it. It's really that simple. And how and why, what works for us is also going to be something that we can look at here. This is an individual journey. Of course, with anything you can find generic understandings that might be generalizable, that might have quite a few people being able to identify, perhaps even with some of these kind of comments that I have suggested on the presentation here. But it's always going to be a unique journey. So here I have included the quote from Lao Tzu, which says, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And the reason that I include this quote and feel that it's relevant for this particular presentation is, if we are invalidating our pain, if we are constantly going around, either as a human or, whether we're looking at this from a practitioner lens, whether we're looking at this from the lens of our clients, if we're going around and we're collecting all of this pain, but we're invalidating, we're not acknowledging it, we're not gaining that awareness within our bodies, within ourselves, to say, yeah, this is impacting me, then we're going to be walking, 1,000 miles in very, very painful states of being. And I think all of us know, to some degree or another, we can use our imaginations to conceptualize how that can be problematic and what the outcome of that can be, of walking our journey, continually invalidating the amount that we're carrying. So how, I've pointed out now the fact that we have the potential to do this, to not acknowledge, to not understand, but how can we then? How can we acknowledge and understand our truths? And this is where I draw attention to one concept, which is the inner dialogue. Obviously, there are so many different approaches to psychology which offer fantastic explanations as to how and why we can understand and acknowledge our pain, our truths. But what we're looking at today is the inner dialogue. Now, what is inner dialogue? This was what my research was exploring. It can be called many different things. It can be called self-talk. It can be called inner speech. I found it a fascinating phenomenon to explore, and I have to remind myself that I am now very, very well versed in what inner dialogue might be. But that isn't to say that when I started out this research, I knew the kind of concept of it. I knew that I was having a constant flow of conversation within my mind. And then I assumed that everybody had this, because this is all I could ever remember. This is what I always thought I had. And it was in conversation with some friends very much before I started my doctorate, which I realized they don't experience it in the same way at all. So this kind of, mini apprentice researcher within me starts to explore out of curiosity, probably before I'd even acknowledged that Google Scholar was there, and so probably just on your basic Google, and I was looking into what inner dialogue was, and there was something fascinating about the fact that it had been researched, and the videos or articles that gave an idea of what inner dialogue was were really fascinating. There was something that really hit home, which I think when you're going to take a topic for your research, needs to be something that is fascinating for you and that hits home with you in some way, because it's a long journey. But there was something also quite interesting about how relatively small this massive phenomenon was. So there are so many different definitions of it. It is quite ambiguous, but generally speaking, the way that I'm understanding it and speaking about it is that it's the experience of conversing with oneself within one's thoughts, it can look fundamentally different for each person. And when I say this to you, maybe you're having an idea, oh, yeah, my I can understand my inner dialogue is this, or oh no, I don't have a clue, what she means by that. So we'll have a little think in our own private way while we listen to this. We have this opportunity to kind of work out what inner dialogue might mean to us. And it's a really, really fascinating conversation to have with friends, because if people are interested in sharing, it can be quite a fascinating realization of how similarly or how differently and what that might mean. Endless, endless conversation. I also include the definition offered by Lidlam, who says what the individual experiences, feels, and thinks, but does not yet um, necessarily share in actual conversation. And the reason that I include Lidbom's definition is because it doesn't just speak about the narrative. Of course, when we're using the word dialogue, we're often associating that with communication and conversation, but actually this definition includes the fact that it's all about the experience as well, about the feeling as well, about the thinking. It doesn't have to just purely be about a narrative conversation as we might understand a dialogue. It can be so much more than that. So a little bit about inner dialogue. It's really known to be widely experienced throughout the human population, but it's very, very difficult to measure because it is private, it's invisible, it's hidden, it's so subjective. There are some researchers who have gone a kind of more quantitative direction, who suggest, for example, Hulbert says that you have 30 to 50% of the population have found to be experiencing it in some form, and a few researchers have suggested that it can be anything experienced at anything from 0 to 100% frequency. I definitely feel like I'm later into the 90s when it comes to the frequency of my own inner dialogue, but it seems like quite a nice thought to experience it less, at least for me. But then who knows, someone that experiences it less might be intrigued to experience it in more, and then whether we can experience it more or less by taking more control of it, all of these areas of thought kind of open up. But just as a basic introduction to inner dialogue, it's also very interestingly, while again I reiterate that it's quite limited in the amount of research, this current research in the field of psychology, there are records of mentions and of inner dialogue, if for example early as Plato, but generally speaking it's quite a stigmatized and misunderstood experience. We've got a lot of association with pathologies, a lot of depictions of people speaking to themselves in a negative light. We have specific pathologies, for example, schizophrenia is a classic one where people are portraying this in a very kind of negative, dangerous, almost dirty light in movies and adaptations. And I enjoy a good film as much as the next person, but I just think it's so profoundly damaging when they write continually characters that portray mental health in these ways, because it prevents people from understanding themselves. It can have, and I've spoken to people having given this similar presentations and spoken about my research to other people previously. They have said that these depictions create a sense of embarrassment, shame when they are going, but I experience an inner dialogue, so is there something wrong with me? And I think this is why I do feel passionate about disseminating my research, about speaking about it. And I'm grateful, for example, for Ruth to invite me here today to be able to share this with you guys, because it doesn't it like the research has shown, it is experienced by so much of the population, and yet it is so misunderstood. There is research into the phenomenology of it already. It's just known to be complex and multifaceted and invisible, and so it's quite curious to be researching something that is really relatively ambiguous and so kind of subjective to understand. It can be kind of uh, uh, daunting when you're trying to write something cohesive of it. But I feel like I luckily managed to be able to do that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with just having created and conducted a piece of research which says this experience is universally experienced, but it is so unique. So get to understand, if it's something you're interested in, get to understand it and see how that is experienced by yourself. Yeah, there's also very limited amount into inner dialogue and trauma. A lot of it is on the pathologies, like I've mentioned, and performances comes up quite a lot. You have, especially with sports, people, athletes talking to themselves, and it's just, even that's as strange. Why is it okay for the athlete to publicly talk to themselves, and egg themselves on, but then someone else that isn't doing it for sporty reasons is somehow mad or bad? I'm clearly biased in my feelings towards this. And also there is a lot of research or into showing the correlation between inner dialogue and meaning making. So why, apart from the reasons that I mentioned, did I spend so many years looking into the concept of inner dialogue and trauma? Well, the research is predominantly quantitative, and all of it recommended qualitative lived experience research. As I've mentioned, very much focused on the pathologies, and there is a limit into the aftermath of trauma. So all of these were kind of areas that I was interested in looking into, and hopefully successfully did look into during my research project. So just before I whistle on about it, it's important for me to share with you just vaguely the participants. I had 8 female participants between the ages of 20 and 30 years old who had experienced a rape within the last 5 years. So this research was specifically using participants that had experienced sexual violence, but a lot of the findings that I found feel incredibly relevant and applicable to other forms of pain and abuse and trauma. And indeed, what came up, like I've slightly alluded to already, is the fact that it wasn't always just a traumatic experience in itself which was painful. It wasn't, for example, just a sexual violent experience that was painful, but it was everything that came with that. The method I used was structured existential analysis, and I know that Emmy van Derzen, who founded this approach, has been giving some more talks about it recently, and I haven't been able to attend them during my write-up, but I look forward to seeing how she's recommending the application of it. I strongly recommend it. I strongly recommend it for anyone who might be looking into their methods of conducting a qualitative lived experience research. Because I think IPA is obviously an incredibly popular one, and IPA is the general kind of, at least with me and my peers, the general argument as to why people would choose IPA is because it's really well known how to do it, because it's really, really structured, whereas the papers with structural existential analysis give less concrete, hardcore structure, for the very reason that it's trying to allow a lot of creativity and freedom. And so I created a 8-step model in my research, which hopefully can provide that foundation for anyone that wanted to use that creative experience of structured existential analysis, but also have a little bit of more of a guideline of how to do it. Don't just do IPA because everybody is saying that it's great. It can be so great, of course, but so can SEA. I'd strongly advocate for it. But definitely isn't time to go into detail of that. We're going to be looking at the aftermath of trauma, especially in terms of some of the findings which popped out of my research project. I've included the table of themes here, which, as you can see, are titled and given we've got sub themes coming out of them, and in relation to the existential dimensions for anybody that is kind of interested in existential philosophies. But we're not going to be looking at necessarily all of these. we're going to be looking at a specific few which might be especially relevant to what we're looking at today. So we're going to go over some of these sub themes in more detail in a minute. So in the aftermath of trauma, the burden of self-creation was one of the big themes that came up. The trauma becomes part of our world. This is the briefest way to summarize it. It becomes part of our life world. It becomes part of our self. And it becomes very, very difficult for the participants to form an identity which doesn't have some relevance or relatedness to their experience of trauma. And occasionally it is possible to actively say, actually, no, I'm not going to let that happen. That I'm not going to let that trauma be part of my identity. But then when we look at the kind of concept of authenticity, how does authenticity fit into that? If I'm denying something real that happened to me, then am I being the true version of me? And so this is an example. And like I said, I will just be briefly flowing through some of these because of course it's a lot to go over in a short time. But just, we can look at this from a lens of either for ourselves or for our clients. What does that mean? What does it mean to have the burden of self-creation, to have to include or not include our trauma, especially most likely an unwanted trauma, as part of our identity as we move on? Another theme that is especially prevalent is this concept of wolf in sheep's clothing, that anyone, anywhere, anytime can hurt us. And it's almost this undeniable understanding that participants described having experienced the nature of trauma that they experienced. But again, I think very applicable to many different shocking traumas that involve other people, especially. How to live now within a society where it feels dangerous to a level that had been only perhaps fiction before. It had only been, oh well, that could happen, but now that it has happened, it becomes part of the reality, that danger, in a completely new way. The power that other people and experiences can have over us, it again, something that it can be such a shocking way to understand that the trauma itself is not always the only part that where the power is being held, but years later, for example, a big one is anniversaries. Anniversaries of traumatic experiences can hold power over triggers and sensory responses and stimuli, can be having this power over for years and years and years to come. Some that we're fundamentally aware of. Oh, I know that song reminds me of that. Some that we absolutely can't remember or can't piece together. And suddenly we're walking down the street and we're crying, or our heart feels like it's breaking and we can't quite understand why. All of part of the aftermath of traumatic experiences. The myths and stigma, a really, really powerful one, is the society's understanding of our experiences and how they influence our understandings of the influences. I alluded to this earlier when I was speaking about how people tend to respond to participants, especially in, of course, my research. Participants spoke about how family members, how friends, how the police, how teachers responded to them when they disclosed this painful, traumatic experience that they'd been through, and how if they responded with a stigmatic connotation to their answer, it could be incredibly painful and damaging to them. This labeled life, this sense that we become part of that they're labeled to do with our pain. So of course we have, in terms of sexual violence survivors, we have labels such as survivor, we have victim, but also we can think or on a wider scale or different traumas and pains that we might experience widow, widower, all of these different labels which might come in the aftermath of our trauma. And again, here we are, having just been through something traumatic and having to make that decision: do I identify with that label or not? And if I choose not to identify with it, how can I stop other people calling me that if they find out about my trauma? All these things to have to cope with in the aftermath of trauma. Feeling responsible for trauma, it can create all sorts of pain, all sorts of additional suffering. Often described the blame and the shame as more painful than the experience of the traumatic experience itself. Far longer sense of pain. Really, really deeply eating into the client's well-being, the participant's well-being. And also this awareness that the external world directly influences our internal experiences. This is something that where the next part of the presentation does look into, but how is our external world relating to our internal world? Are we aware of that within ourselves? Is it something that we've given any time to understanding? Are we more situated ourselves? Do we focus more on our external world or our internal world? Are we quite balanced in the way that we do? All of these can be really important questions for ourselves and questions for our clients when we are looking at how they're coping or how we're coping in the aftermath of traumatic events. So we're going to look at this. How can we cope in the aftermath of trauma? Well, as I've said before, we have whole approaches to psychology and philosophy which give lots of fantastic reasons. But what we're going to be looking at today is what came up in my research, of course. So I've included this quote from the Buddha here, which says, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." So let's consider our private inner world, and especially our private inner world of awareness, because if we remember at the beginning of the presentation, I was asking the question, how can we gain that awareness? How can we gain awareness of what does and doesn't feel right? How can we gain awareness of our own truths, of our own experiences? And I have a suggestion: our little inner tribe. Now, the inner tribe is a relational entity. It's private, it's ours, even though I'm here, publicly speaking about it today, and all of us are kind of in our fake public version of Zoom world. We are ultimately speaking about something that nobody else that you ever encounter has to understand how you're interpreting this or how your clients will be interpreting this. It's completely private, it's completely invisible, it's completely hidden until we decide to share it with others if we choose. It can be colonized by external influences, and this is a really big one. This is how we were speaking, for example, of the myths and stigma, the impact of society, when other people get into our heads, to use a less official term. The inner tribe requires attention, it requires focus, it requires engagement, much like a friendship. If we can't expect any relation in our world to exist if we're not giving it attention and focus and engagement in some way, and it can offer safety and protection. So this is the inner tribe. And what do I mean by the inner tribe? Well, in all 8 transcripts from the participants, which I asked questions about their inner dialogue, how they experience their inner dialogue, how they experience their dialogue in relation to trauma, these 8 kind of characterizable entities came up for me, and all of them were present in all 8 participants. And it feels really important to mention that, because even though we were talking about a topic which is profoundly uncomfortable, profoundly painful, these 8 characters arose, and as you'll notice, they're not negative, they're not bad, they're not just dark entities. They are quite light and quite hopeful in many ways. And so I will go through them just briefly, but I invite you as I go through them to kind of consider how your own tribe might look, how it might be influenced by others, which characters in this tribe, if you can identify them, if you can relate to them, which might be stronger, which might get more focus, which might be completely neglected. Um, so our inner dialogue can be like a best friend. If we start with the best friend at the top, our inner dialogue can be like a best friend. It can be communicating to ourselves in a really, really nurturing way, in a way that's completely biased and on your side, even if you are, completely in the wrong. This is a very glory of a best friend. Um, it can be supporting you through all of the difficult times, but just like your best friend in the real world, they can also have a fight with you. They can also say the wrong thing. The best friend, and if you're really believing with that and relating with that part of your inner dialogue, and it's that nurturing voice saying, yeah, you really deserve that, which is an example, a very real life example of what some of the participants experienced when they were sharing, when they were disclosing their traumatic experience. Their real life best friend said to them, yeah, but you shouldn't have worn that, should you? Or, well, you did get into their car, or you did, you chose that, so you kind of deserved it. Well, that suddenly becomes that inner dialogue, and this is how that inner dialogue, one example of how this inner dialogue and how this inner tribe can manifest is through the words of others. And yet that one sentence from that other person can live within for years, years and years to come, if it isn't questioned, if it isn't acknowledged, if it isn't reflected upon. The dreamer, and this is, spoiler alert, this is the recurring theme throughout all of the 8 characters, is that they can be both light and dark. Let's say they can be both joyful and painful, these different entities. The dreamer can be that part of our inner dialogue which hopes for all of the good things in life, that allows us to carry the dream, the wishes, the goals in our life, and allows us to transport ourselves there, whether that's in a verbal way, whether that's in an imagery way, however our inner dialogue is experienced, however that communication with self is experienced. But also the dreamer can be the nightmare. It can be the one that constantly haunts us. It can be the one replaying the painful imaginary version of what did or didn't happen, of what could or couldn't happen. The detective. Now, the detective is one that I think I feel is sometimes spoken about as an overthinker. And I want to kind of slightly rephrase what we talk about, or I hear spoken about with friends, clients, even depicted on the TV. This overthinker, this I think too much, always with a negative connotation. There's something wrong with me, or, oh, it's my fault, I overthink everything. I was going to make a decision, but I overthought it again. Something, criticizing something negative that I do. I like to invite us to rephrase that and say the detective. We have this detective within us, constantly questioning, constantly asking, constantly puzzle piecing, trying to support us, trying to protect us, trying to understand the world for us. Do we listen to the detective when he actually comes across something, or do we say, actually, I'm for whatever reason going to ignore that and keep moving on? You're trying to give me that awareness that I'm seeking, that I know that I'm needing, but actually I'm going to ignore that. The enlightened, we have these eureka kind of moments. This is something that I was speaking of during the earlier parts of the presentation in relation to the aftermath of trauma. For example, this hyper awareness suddenly of the dangers of reality, for example, the dangers of um other people in society or certain situations in society. This enlightened sudden, again, we can have the light and the dark. We can have these amazing euphoric understandings of, oh wow, something that is going to be changing our life in a positive way forever. But again, same, we can have these enlightened moments of I can never not know that, and it's incredibly painful, and I wish that I never had to. Often being the awareness of that trauma being part of your reality, which like we were speaking about at the beginning, it can be incredibly hard to acknowledge. But when we do, that moment of it switches on and go, yep, don't want to believe it, but that happened to me. It can be incredibly profound moment that occurs within our inner dialogue, within our inner tribe. Another character which emerged for me during my findings was this time traveler within us. We have this capacity within our inner dialogue to go to all different areas of time. We can go to the future, we can go to the past, we can be in the present, especially when we are in very meditative moments, whether we're in a actual meditation practice, yogic practice. Walking in the nature is a very, very easy one to be, or very helpful one to be, drawing us to that moment. This can be fantastic. Again, I'm so in this moment, I am so absorbing all of the goodness from the trees, from the very, very cold frost which I was experiencing this morning. Or we have that darker side, we have that painful side, the time travel, which when we've had a traumatic experience, holds us back into the past, traps us there, keeps us there, forever replaying that painful experiences, and how we can pull ourselves out of that. What other community, tribe members of our inner dialogue can we call on to pull ourselves out, to travel in a different place, and to start to heal and not suffer continuously. The critic. Now, the critic, I would say, is the most celebrity in a tribal member. The character which I hear spoken about all the time. Oh, my inner critic. I'm so critical in my inner dialogue. I have a very critical inner dialogue. And again, always with a bad rep. The critic is spoken about almost as a separate entity, like I am doing with all of these. But at the same time, it's ourselves. So on one hand, we're having this angry sense of, oh, I'm criticizing myself again, to that entity, but it's also me. So I'm angry at something else, but I'm also angry at me. This incredible way that humans have to just completely neglect the fact that they're going through something difficult and find a way to make it more difficult. But I also want to give some kudos to the critic. Doesn't always have to be seen as this awful entity. In fact, some of the participants in my study were speaking about the beneficial fact that the critic can teach us what we are and aren't, what it might not be good for us, what might be good and bad for us. For example, drinking was something this came up in aftermath of trauma, turning to substances which might help to alleviate or take away from the pain was incredibly common. But actually the critic was able to say, no, when you drink like that in that location, it's not good and can put you in danger. And the participants that said, I noticed it was a critical voice, but I noticed that it came from a place of kind of compassion, and I actually listened to that critic, and my life got better from that. I didn't drink in that situation, and I found myself in safer situations. The chameleon, we have this inner dialogical part that can just shapeshift. It can transform when we're in the different mood states, when we're in the different social situations, when we're different senses of pain and suffering and less. This adaptive nature of our inner dialogue, sometimes with our choice and sometimes quite without our choice. Again, a question for us: how can we take control of that? Is it possible to take control of us? Can we choose it to shape or shift, or is it without our control? And third, but not finally, the professor. We have this this teacher within us, this aspiration in our inner dialogue to continually learn, to continually gain understandings and explain and re-explain. Again, this can be so helpful, so beneficial, and it can also be incredibly tiresome, probably similar to teachers in class, maybe, I don't know. I also say that, remember, this was just what came from my study. I invite us to be super, super creative with it. This 8 characters came up for my within my participants' transcripts, but you know, think how many other entities, if you choose to use this slightly creative way of understanding your inner dialogue. I think what else might be meaningful to you, and what might else be existing in your mind. We might have an artist that transformed everything into something beautiful, or something haunting, or something scary. We might have the advocate. Now, this was a big theme that came up. People that experienced these traumatic events had this inner advocate that was suddenly always needing to do something, needing to make a difference, needing to make a change. The philosopher, uh, always questioning, always questioning. So, like I said, this is not the only way to approach an understanding of how we can cope in a life after trauma, but it's one slightly different one. It's one slightly creative one. And it's one which is going to be completely uniquely experienced. I think in itself it can be quite a useful tool, whether that was to be used as a specific framework, or whether that is something to see, invite clients to kind of go on that journey and see what they find, who they find within their inner dialogue. It is that kind of magical, mythical sense of it is me, but it's also something that isn't me. I can identify with it, looking away from it, but while also knowing that it is part of me. There's something quite special about being able to break ourself into the bits, and not be scared of it, and not be stigmatic about it. Whatever the past, present, and future holds within our inner dialogue, we are never alone. I also suggest that we don't torture our inner dialogue. We don't torture that inner tribe. I include this little quote from Winnie the Pooh, which reminds us, okay, now we're thinking about something very potentially cognitive, something very about dialogue and narrative, but let's remember that this is about that awareness that we're gaining. We are a thinking being, but we are a feeling being. We are experiencing being. So let's invite that inner dialogue to 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 draw that relationship, to bond that relationship, to give us access to parts of ourselves, not to just stay in that cognitive. Yeah, indeed. Sometimes it's important to get out of your head and back into your heart. Let's remember that we are everything in every moment, and let's use this as a way to access that. I think we've got maybe a couple of more minutes, so I just very briefly skim over some of the therapeutic implications, which I identified that could be particularly compatible with this theory of understanding our inner dialogue and trauma, like I have presented today. I don't suggest that it's the only way to look at it. I don't suggest that it's a kind of fully fledged theory in itself. Maybe I will find the inspiration in myself one day to create that. I would like to turn it in a book one day in some shape or form, but for now I think it can be a helpful little resource for us to kind of pair up with other approaches. I think obviously Alfred Lengel's personal existential analysis does specifically already look at inner dialogue, and for those familiar with it, it will be a nice easy one to kind of give an expansion on an entity already part of the structure that he offers. But also another one that I would like to bring attention to is internal family systems, which is Richard Schwartz's theory. For those who have not looked into it, is really beautiful. And I suppose what some of the similarities is this sense that even the difficult parts of ourselves, they don't have to be demonized. Yeah, we have characteristics within our inner dialogue, or voices, or thoughts, or feelings, essences, whatever we want to call it, whatever feels right for us to call it, that can be uncomfortable, that can feel unwanted, that can feel painful, that can feel dark. But, and this is something that Richard Schwartz, and myself, of course, do really, really advocate for, is that if we are going to treat those in a way that they're not wanted, to speak to them badly, to create them as unwanted, it doesn't take them away, but it gives them power in a different way. It gives them power in a way that is not helpful for us, and they can become much, much larger, and much more a sense of having feeling them being out of control. Um, and if we can start to look at them with compassion, with curiosity, much like I have mentioned within our inner tribe, there might be great and there might be difficult parts of each of these characteristics. And whether we choose to communicate with them, understand them in an angry way, or whether we do so in a compassionate and curious way, is going to fundamentally impact how we are experiencing that, how we're able to understand it. Often, much like Richard Schwartz in his internal family systems model, um, often whatever's going on for us is going on for a reason, to protect us, or had protected us in the past from something, and may or may not still be helpful for us. So yeah, like I said, really I would recommend looking into some of these if you haven't heard of these already, and just using this model to kind of apply to any theories that you find particularly interesting. Some reflections about what we've discussed before we close together today is that our experiences are unique, and they are ever changing. Life is uncertain. We have no idea 100% what's going to come, but if we can create this relationship with ourselves, that deeper relationship with ourselves, um, and continually explore that, we have this much stronger position, much more well-equipped position to face what might be um in our path in the future. Let's try to work together to stop inner dialogue being understood as something that is so pathologized, that it just is, it's so damaging for the people who are experiencing it as a form of unwellness, and it's damaging for the people who are not. Either way, I just don't see how it can be helpful to continually pathologize such an innate, such a potentially powerfully magnificent experience, lived experience, that so many humans do experience. We have to, I recommend that we see trauma, not just as that singular event, but as something which has a very, very big potential to have a long-lasting aftermath. How we are responding in our own aftermath, how other people respond to us in the aftermath. Look, rather than working with clients only looking at the traumatic event in itself, but to ask them, what was it like in the very moments after? What was it like when you told this person or this person? How did you choose who to share? How did they respond to this? All incredibly important investigations, because a lot of the pain and the long-lasting suffering can be embedded in these experiences which are often overlooked. And society's perceptions, their stigmas, their stereotypes, the myths that they create about all of these lived experiences, but especially, of course, relevant for today is the traumatic ones. They can completely impede how people heal, how people are able to overcome these inevitable, first-hand or vicarious experiences of suffering. So while we can't change that society has these perceptions, they've been prevalent from the beginning, and I dread to say they probably will be there in some shape or form until the end. While we can't change what those around us are going to be thinking, saying, doing, we can change the way that we and those around us and our clients understand it, the fact that this is what's going on, and how that they can best equip themselves to live in this world. So like Ruth says, I did a couple of different projects alongside my studies, and they are projects that I continue to look at. The Global Existential Summit took place this January, the 3rd to the 7th. But if people are interested in finding out more about existential ideas from a number of different speakers from around the world, I did interviews with 25 different speakers, and it can be an interesting introduction for those who are less familiar with it, and they can be an interesting uh, larger exploration from a global perspective for people who are already a little bit familiar with existential philosophy. So that is there. It is still possible to access all of the 25 talks from that summit as well. And if you are interested in looking at existential ideas through maybe other creative means, so I have a book list, I have reading series lists, film lists, different projects going on existential offerings, and you're more than welcome. And I try and keep everything incredibly low cost or free to just include as many people as possible into a field of a world of thought, let's say, that I feel has really, really just benefited my life and those around me a lot. So always keen to include people. But I think really that's it from me today, and I thank you all so much for taking the time to join.
Natalie, thank you so much for such a truly thought-provoking talk. I know that as you were chatting, I was writing down various different things that were coming to me as you were speaking. So now we're really lucky. We've got half an hour for questions or for comments. So, have a think. As I mentioned to you before, either you can pop that in the chat and I will read it out to Natalie, or you can pop your hand up either virtually using the hand up technique, or you can do it in real life. I will keep an eye on that too. Yeah, do kind of have your questions and comments, because it's really wonderful to hear from you. But whilst I give you a chance to have a think about that, I had a couple of thoughts that came to my mind, Natalie. Actually, I just wondered, in terms of the kind of the characters that had come up within your research, were those ones that had developed as a kind of consequence of their trauma, or those ones that they had a longer history with? I was interested as to the kind of the evolution of those characters within your participants' experience.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and while you document everything, while you are researching and developing your findings, that is my big question as to how exactly did those, like, why create a tribe at all? Like, I could have, I think I write it in my thesis actually, that it could have been easy to create a really kind of complicated psychological theory to kind of describe our inner dialogue. But I reckon that those characteristics developed because I feel very strongly about raising awareness kind of in a more accessible way. I think there is so much value in the psychological approaches and the complicated theories. Of course, they are what they are, and there is a time and place for them. But at the same time, we as practitioners are trying to support everyday people, as it were, and children often. And so how how can it hurt, or how can we support people? It can be helpful to support people with a kind of with a concept, or with a method, or with an approach which can be relatable. And I think that was in mind while this was developing for me,
Mm,
as a researcher. None of the characters themselves like defined, other than the inner critic,
mm,
were explicitly mentioned by
mm,
the participants. But there was something that within, and I remember sitting outside, because it was that really boiling hot summer that we had all locked down. So I was sitting outside, and I remember having lots of bubble charts developing, and I remember thinking, how how can it be that these characteristics are forming for
mm,
me, and they how can they be in every single, and I felt it really important to just make sure they were present for all of them, and
mm,
each of them were encapsulated by a number of different quotes. So it would be fascinating to see if these characteristics existed. I think because I've chosen characteristics that are relatable, they are
yeah.
conceptualized in a way that you can understand, that you can picture, that it's unlikely that someone would complete say, I have zero relate. I don't know, maybe, but I'm unable to make that connection, because but that's because I think humans are incredibly creative. And so now that I've kind of put that out there, it's there.
Mm,
Whereas if someone was to say, right, there's a tribe within you, how do you identify that tribe? People often come up with completely different things too. But it's fun way to explore something painful.
absolutely. And it's so kind of vivid and visceral, isn't it? I think it brings up so much. We've got a question here from Carolina. May I ask why trauma as the experience and the important aspect of the field of psychotherapy for your particular interest, Natalie? So why you were drawn to that particular aspect of the field?
Yeah, so I found it really important to do a piece of research on something that could relate to. And so I experienced multiple rapes in my young adulthood. And so it's an experience which has impacted me, um and who I am. And so of course that was a big part of that research, to identify um how I was able to distinguish between my own, and there was a lot of reflective practices involved, um to create that data as something that is pure and relevant to my clients rather than myself. But yeah, that is the truthful answer to that. And it's strange to be able to speak about that, and to speak
Mm,
about that quite openly. But I realize that the fact that it is not spoken about openly all the time is part of what makes going through sexual violent experiences something that is so humiliating and painful, and stigmatized and shamed. And so when I have kind of come to terms with the fact that my doctorate is ended, which I find quite an intense experience in it itself, it's something that I would like to put a lot more time and investment into, is to just create a space for trauma survivors, for sexual violence survivors, to understand their experience, and if they want to have a space to talk about it more. So yeah, that's why trauma
mm.
was my field of, yeah.
Thank you for that, Natalie. I think it's I couldn't agree with you more. I think, even though there have been so many kind of movements in terms of destigmatizing sexual violence and to get people to talk about it, there's still such a huge amount of shame. And I think also in terms of kind of professionals working in psychology or mental health, being able to talk about whether they've been experienced sexual violence or whether they're experiencing mental health problems. I still think there's a whole load of kind of stigma around talking about that. And I think it's so powerful, the work that you're doing in terms of actually breaking some of that down and opening up spaces, because I think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done on both sides of the consulting room, if you like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's a really interesting one for the practitioner to understand when they're considering their public identity. And of
Mm,
course that's going to depend on how much you put out of yourself out there. I mean, I know practitioners who don't have any social media, no online presence, so that what their client experiences with them is as much as possible just purely between themselves and the client. And me, I never necessarily saw myself as someone that would go and give lots of talks and presentations or would start kind of conferences and stuff. That wasn't something that I had contemplated doing. And so contemplating my public identity and what that would mean if a client encountered my presentations or
mm,
and heard my views or heard about my lived experiences and how that would influence my therapy. It has been something to consider and something that I've engaged in a lot of kind of reflective discussions around with different clients, with different speakers. And everyone has often got a really interesting answers. So if it's something that you as a practitioner are questioning, I would say just most importantly, trust yourself and find out what your priority is. Is it more important to me to be completely unknown and therefore completely pure in my relationship with my clients, or is it more important for me to get this message out and then have the chance for clients to understand a different part of me before, and that be a part of the therapy room. But also having discussions really, really helps as well. Yeah.
mm, mm. Thank you, Natalie. It's really important stuff to thinking about if you're working within the field. So just a reminder, if anyone does want to ask any questions. We have a question, Alex. How wonderful! Please pop your question to Natalie. Thank you.
Hi, Natalie. I just want to say thank you. I really, really enjoyed that. I particularly resonated with the bit where you were talking about invalidating trauma. I'm at the beginning of my journey. I'm year one of NSPC, so it's quite nice to see you at the other end and how you've come out the other side. It was fascinating. I was interested to see how do you feel your relationship has changed with your inner voice since doing all this work?
It's a really good question. I at the moment, so having graduated, I feel I've been in this real state of numbness. I really it's a really big journey that you're about to embark on, but I really support your decision to do it. I would not change it for a thing, and you are in a very, very supportive um place. Use that support, contact the faculty and get involved because it's a really special journey. But I think no one, even if they had told me, I wouldn't have been able to actually take it on board. But it's such an intense journey um to go through that level of studying at that level of personal self-exploration while you're taking on board all of your client work slowly and steadily. And you can, what's great about the NSPC is that it does offer that you can pick things up and drop things down and do it at your own pace. I kind of rushed through it and did it in 4 years, and I wanted to do that. I set out to do that. I'm happy that I did that, but it was intense. And so in the aftermath of the doctorate, my relationship with my inner dialogue is to try and give it space, which I find really, really difficult. And part of me wants to spend more time. I often think, I'd like to actually do a bit more, like, it sounds silly because I've spent the last over 4 years, like, from 10 years of psychological studies looking at myself. But I think it would be a really fun exercise to do, to start getting in the habit, but uh in a really explicit kind of exercise way for myself, just because it's fun. Like, I think it's
Mm,
a really big one for me is that working with painful experiences does not have to be a painful experience. And I think clients find that surprising, and clients can benefit that a lot. Like, obviously, you have to sit in the pain, and you do have to sit in the suffering, and there are moments of real seriousness and just real hurt, but there can also be fun, there can also be laughter and giggles and joy, as we get to understand ourselves and realize that that pain does it is only in the moment, and we have more control over how it exists in our moment as possible. But already, like, without having made a point of actually engaging with that model as an actual concept, I noticed myself becoming a lot more compassionate within myself when something is happening. Oh, the detective, like, I think, especially the detective, I guess I think I'm curious a lot. Maybe that was a really big one for me. It's a very present, a very powerful one.
So
And to notice, yeah, carry on.
do you think people, so I've probably misremembered, but so do you think people tend to have bigger biases towards different ones?
I definitely think that people have stronger characters, and just becoming aware of that and working out, oh, do I want that to be strong, or do I want, is there something else that neglect? Like, it's one of those things, it's like you can't unhear it. And so now that you've listened to this today, it's quite likely that next time you, I don't know, catch yourself maybe thinking so much about one thing that happened in the past, you'll be like, oh, I had a time traveler. Like, if you let yourself jump into that ridiculousness, then it can exist for you.
So do you think you can balance it up to not be, to be more balanced between them all?
I think if you make an active effort, and I think that this gives you a tangible way of working with something invisible and intangible, and it can give you that kind of strength to give them the space to evolve and to work out how they relate to each other. But I really advocate that people don't just necessarily go with the 8 that I identified. Like, work out what exists for you. Even just something like, writing down on a little pieces of paper and building your tribe. Like, why not? This is the point of life. It's so creative, and we can create this massive army or tribe within ourselves if we want it. And then sometimes we can say, right, I need all of you to retire right now. I just need me and my best friend to go and sit in a field together, and everyone else go nap. Like, I think that's what's fun about existence.
Yeah, I really like it, because it feels, it's like something that you recognize, even though it was never explicit for me before. And I can imagine sort of creating a new one if there's something particular that I want to do.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's interesting. Emily has just made a comment. Emily's an art therapist, and was saying it'd be a really interesting exercise to invite their clients to draw their inner tribe, which I just thought was absolutely fabulous. And it actually reminded me that in some of the work I've done with autistic young people, that's one of the things they would come to me with would be drawings of the characters that were their inner dialogue that they'd always had. So they'd have, a character that was, different anime characters often that would be their kind of inner dialogue. Sometimes would be misunderstood actually, and they would be diagnosed with kind of schizophrenia, when actually what was going on was their really kind of visceral, vibrant experience of their inner world. So it really just chimed in with what you were saying, Emily, and what you were saying also, Natalie and Alex. So we've got another question here, which is fantastic. So this is from Neil. So thank you for this. Your engagement with this and your presentation has made me very engaged also. I've been reflecting on how trauma can be associated can be associated with very personal, non-stereotypical experiences. The event and the experience on the individual can be felt traumatically and a blight of life, but it may be anything but traumatic to another. To simplify, trauma seems to be the bearer's individual response to the experience. Hearing, listening to the inner voice seems key here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Neil. I think it's that central component that you were talking about, Natalie, right at the very beginning, which is the kind of the uniqueness of the person's experience of trauma, and the whole trauma experience. So right from, as the years roll by, and I think it kind of brings up, how rigid some of the definitions clinically that we might work with when it comes to an issue of trauma, but actually how wide those experiences can actually be, which links into a lot of kind of existential ideas around trauma, actually, which I think is often really useful to kind of dip into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So anyone who has any other questions, keep them coming. We've still got a bit of time with Natalie, which is absolutely wonderful. Natalie, I was wondering actually whether I was interested, and I don't know whether this came out within your research, it might not have done, whether there was a difference in the limited research that there was, as I know the background on inner dialogue is not plentiful, as you mentioned, but whether there was a difference in terms of people's experience kind of around the globe in different cultures or in different ages. I wondered if that was anything that came out, or it might not have been present.
I did not put an explicit focus on the geographical location and the demographics is the word I was looking for, of my participants. But what was noticeable was that participants who openly spoke about having stronger connections with Eastern philosophies, Eastern perspectives on life, that were focused on honing their awareness within themselves, practicing meditation, practicing yoga, practicing self-compassion, had a much more nurturing, advocacy-based aftermath of their trauma in comparison to people who notably and openly found themselves neglecting their self-connection, and they often had a much darker, more painful experience with their trauma.
That's really interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so much more research that you could do, or that could be done.
I know, but yeah,
never ending. I think either Digby or Emmy has their hand up to ask a question. So,
or Bruno.
Yeah, the dog.
Yes, it's definitely not Bruno at the minute. Thank you very much, Natalie, for a very heartfelt presentation. You obviously put a great deal of emotional commitment into it and into your work on trauma, and I'm sure everybody has appreciated that this evening. I wanted to ask a rather simple question about dialogue. So if, for example, you have an inner critic and you're in dialogue with that inner critic, does the critic listen to you? Is it actually a dialogue in which the critic accepts the points you make? Or is it the kind of dialogue where actually it's a non-listening kind of dialogue and the critic just goes on and on saying the same old things?
Yeah, I suppose always that's going to be reflected in that individual experience, isn't it? I think when I was looking at through the transcripts, it was often that the character, let's say, for example, the critic, was the kind of active, and the self that you were experiencing it coming towards you, with the dialogue from the other, let's say, towards yourself. But I suppose what this model and this way of conceptualizing it can invite us to do is to become more active in our engagement. So when that critic is going on and on at us, to participate, have the courage, have the awareness that we can communicate back. And that doesn't, again, that's where I think drawing on compassion and, you know, IFS influences can be so important to say, not just go, oh, the critic's attacking me, so I'm going to be attacking it too, but to say, oh, the critics are attacking me, but with my curiosity, being that phenomenological research, to draw in, let's say, that detective within us, explore why they're needing to criticize, what message they might be trying to achieve by that. Because often I would suggest, especially if we look at the kind of existential, looking at emotions, you know, there's always a message there to be seen. We can have that critic attack us, or we can participate in a critical attack with any part of our inner dialogue till the cows come home, but it doesn't have to be the way.
Yes, but some of your participants experience, say, inner critics or other sub-personas as changing in response to that dialogical process.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you know, there's hope. It's not just you're stuck with this inner population of people
exactly
who have fixed opinion.
Yeah, I would say, and having just that awareness, and to kind of, yeah, I'm really glad that you bring that up, because I think that's a really, really big part of it. To be curious, to, when we are noticing something that's in our inner dialogue, to go, where did that come from? You know, well, that's my neighbor's voice, my mother's voice, my father's voice, my teacher's voice, for good or for bad. And to say, okay, do we still need it to be there? Why was it? Why do you reckon it was there at the beginning? Was it ever beneficial? Okay, it was. Is it still beneficial? Oh no, it's not. Should we look at giving it a rest then? But I think really that it always to be done in a kind of a compassionate way rather than a aggressive way, I've noticed is a really, really important way of working with this concept, because it can be very easy to be angry at something that feels uncomfortable or is overtly hurting us. Yeah, it's a kind of a human response, but to realize that doesn't actually always help us, and that those bits of us that are hurting us are often hurting themselves, and how we can kind of heal them, and then they can heal us.